Hello, my name is Mr. Cadella, and today I'm going to teach you different watercolor techniques. You see I have this worksheet here. This is just on copy paper, so this isn't really nice watercolor paper, so it will kind of wrinkle and maybe even turn a little bit gray as we're working on it, and that's fine. It'll turn back to a nice vibrant color like this one. But the first thing we're going to start off with is a value scale. You'll notice the values are not sequential. They go from 2, 4, 6, 7, and 8 because it's really hard to get a 10 value with some colors, and obviously 1 is just white, so we don't need that one on here, but we'll create a little watercolor value scale. We'll also learn different brush styles and some washes. So let's go ahead and move on here. I'm going to go ahead and choose a darker color. Do not choose black or yellow. Yellow is way too light, and black's, in my estimation, just a little too easy. So I'm going to go ahead and grab some blue here. I'm going to go ahead and paint this in. Now I'm trying to match this square, the value of this color, to this one up here. So my blue, I'm trying to get it to match this value right up here. Now don't worry if you don't get it exactly correct. You can always go back and fix it, but make sure that you do fix it. So right there. Now if it's a little too light, all I have to do is go back and add a little bit more color into that. Some colors are a little bit easier to do this with. Violet and blue, a little bit easier to do a value scale with. Like I mentioned, yellow is very difficult to do because it's so light. So I'm going to go ahead and start painting this one here. Now I'm trying to match this square to the 7 value there. Now notice it's just a tad bit lighter. I'm going to take my time with this, and again, if you make it too dark or too light, you can go back and tweak it. It's always a little easier to make it a little darker. It's a little bit harder to make it lighter. So now I'm going to go ahead and do 6. Now notice I didn't grab new water or paint in my paintbrush. I just went from 7 to 6. In fact, the more you paint, the lighter it should get, just because there's less paint and less water in the paintbrush. There, less pigment. Now those look generally about the same, so I can go back and tweak this. I can already tell this one needs to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to go back and just grab a little bit more paint and darken this up. Again, just take your time with this. Make sure you get accurate values. Where does this help out in your final painting? Well, of course, when you're painting from life, if you need to adjust values with color, this will help out immensely. You already have that practice. I'm going to go back. I'm going to even add a little bit more paint to this one just to make it a touch darker here. There we go, just a little darker. Watercolor will dry just a little bit lighter too as well. I'm going to get a little bit of water here in my brush, a little bit of paint. Come over here, do the 4. I'm going to start intentionally just a little lighter than I should, and that's a good tip to remember. Start a little lighter than you should. Because like I said, it's easier to go darker than it is to go lighter with watercolor. Now notice I got a little dark spot there. I'm going to just mop that up with my paintbrush. I just dry off my paintbrush and kind of mop it up. Just like you'd mop a puddle on the floor, you just kind of mop that little puddle up there. Now, in my estimation, this is the most difficult one to do. It's the lightest value. Got a little too much pigment there, so I just take some out with my paper towel right out of the paintbrush. There we go. You got to be very careful with this one. Notice I'm just getting a little bit of paint at a time. There's barely any paint in this one. And if I get way too much paint on the whole thing, I could just dab it with my paper towel. It'll lift off some of that paint. Now do remember this copy paper turns a little gray, so it actually darkens it up just a little bit more than it should, but once it dries it should be fine. Next I'm going to go to brush styles. So we have wet on dry, dry brush, and wet into wet. Now wet on dry is pretty obvious to figure out. You just take wet paint and put it on dry paper. This one's pretty easy to do. You can have a little bit of fun with this and use a couple different colors if you want to. If you just remember, don't make huge puddles with this, okay? You don't want a lot of puddles when it comes to watercolor most of the time. So there's my wet on dry technique. Pretty easy to figure out. Now my dry brush technique is a little bit different. I'm going to dry out my paintbrush really well, and you can even feel it with your fingers and kind of feel how much water's still left in there. Alright. Then I'm going to go back. You could choose a different color. I'll just use red again because it's already moist here. I'm going to go ahead and use a dry brush. You see how you can start to see the bristles? The more I paint, the less even it becomes. So it started off sort of even like the wet on dry, but the more I painted, you started to see a little bit more of the bristles in the stroke. And if you want to, you can always practice on another piece of paper. Okay, and I'll show you one big mistake that I often see when people try doing the dry brush technique. They get way too much water and they end up doing this. And that's again just wet on dry. It's not dry brush. So they need to dry out their paper towel really well and then go get that paint. Okay, and again, you may want to test it on that copy paper just in case. Now, I'm going to do wet on wet. Now, this is going to start with wet paper. I'm going to start with sort of a pink background here. I'm going to drop a different color in. You could use the same color to drop in, but I'm going to do a different color. So you start with a wet piece of paper there, and then you might even just want to add just a touch more water. Again, you don't want to make huge puddles or anything like that. Now I'm going to go clean up my paintbrush. I'm going to grab some of this blue. I'm going to drop this color in. And you can see how the water does a lot of the work. That blue just starts spreading out. Now, you can add several different colors. With the wet on into wet technique, if you add too many colors, it just starts turning into kind of a muddy gray mess. So you probably don't want to do a ton of colors. And also, in wet onto wet, if the colors don't move around too much, if you put in a little spot, like for example, I'll just do that in a corner right here. I can already see it's a little dry. If I do that and it doesn't move much, then you need to go back and add more water to that so it'll move around there. There you go. Now I'm going to move on to the flat wash. The flat wash is sort of like what I've already done with wet on dry. I'll go ahead and grab some yellow this time. And a flat wash, just like the name implies, is that there's no change in the value, or very little change in the value. There's not a lot of different colors or anything like that. It's just a flat wash. Okay, just one color and just one value right there. Now I'm going to do glazing. Now glazing will start off, let's go ahead and start off with a little bit of red here. It starts off with one color, alright, sort of like the flat wash, and we're going to let this dry up a little bit. So I'm not done with the glazing part. I'm going to let that dry a little bit more. Then I'm going to come over and do the graduated wash. Sometimes this is called a graded wash. So I'm going to come back to the glazing here in just a moment and let it dry. So I'm going to switch over. I'm going to mix up some color this time. Let's mix up a nice green. So I'll grab some of this yellow right here. I'm going to grab just a touch of this blue. Make up a nice green here. Maybe a little bit more blue. There we go. Now I'm going to start at the top. I'm going to load up this paintbrush with a lot of paint. I'm going to start at the top with as much color as I possibly can. You could do this on the side. You can have it start on the bottom if you want to. I'm just going to start at the top. And then, the further I go down, I'm going to clean out my paintbrush, get rid of some of that paint, get a little bit more water. But the further I go down, I'm going to use a little bit more water and less paint. So I'm still using a little bit of paint right now. I'm not using a ton. I'm using more water, but I'm also not trying to make puddles again. And the further I go down, actually I'm going to clean out my paintbrush. I'm going to use just water. I'm going to drag in some of this paint from up here. I might actually grab just a little bit more paint. There we go. So I don't want it completely white down here. There we go. Just a touch more there. There you go. Graduated wash starts with the intense color or darker color, and it fades out to a lighter color. Now I'm going to come back to the glazing. This is dry enough. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back over with another wash. So this is actually multiple layers. I'm going to come back over with this color right here, this yellow. There we go. Just like that. Makes kind of a nice yellow-orange color there. And those are our watercolor techniques. Now, why would we use these different kind of watercolor techniques? Now, wet on dry, just to give you an example, maybe a landscape, you would use this maybe for the grass, and then maybe you would glaze back over top of it for different details. Maybe a graduated wash, instead of a green color, if I used a blue, this might be a great sky technique right here. Or maybe I want some clouds, so maybe I do a wet into wet type technique with that. So there are many different purposes for using these different type of techniques in your project.